Fantastic. Welcome, welcome, everyone. I see a lot of folks trickling into the webinar. Welcome again. Hello, and welcome to our webinar, Entrepreneurial Diplomacy for the Next World Order. My name is Ken, and I'm a member of Fletcher's Office of Strategic Partnerships. Whether it's your morning, your afternoon, or your evening, thank you for joining us. Thank you to our partners around the world. Thank you to the Fletcher alumni who are here, and thank you to all of you who are new to Fletcher. If this is your first time attending one of our webinars, welcome. The Fletcher School at Tufts University is the first standalone graduate school of global affairs in the United States, founded in 1933. Our guiding principle is to embrace the full scope of global affairs, to ground our understanding of policy and diplomacy in the broader context of law, economics, business, technology, environment, and many other areas that shape global affairs. Now, before I introduce the dynamic duo leading today's webinar, I would like to spotlight the Fletcher Global Diplomacy Institute. As you can see, it will take place October 26th through 30th in person here at the Fletcher School in Medford, Massachusetts. And GDI, as we call it, the Global Diplomacy Institute, is designed to be a strategic retreat for mid-career and senior professionals. As a participant, you will enhance your leadership and strategic capabilities, discuss the future of geopolitics, economic diplomacy, global governance, climate, migration, technology, and more. And of course, you'll build your transnational network of fellow practitioners. These are your diplomat peers. Now, GDI is open to individual participants and group delegations, meaning you can attend alone or your organization can sponsor a group to attend together. Now, as a participant, you can expect to engage in keynote addresses with high-level dignitaries and attend site visits to non-governmental and private sector organizations. In 2025, we were honored to hold our inaugural institute, welcoming 22 participants representing 16 countries across 5 continents. And if you're interested in learning more about the program, please scan the QR code found in the bottom left corner of your screen. This is the giant orange circle that you'll find in the lower left-hand corner. In addition, I'm going to put a link to the GDI program page right here in the chat. And I'll share more about the Global Diplomacy Institute a little bit later. But first, leading today's webinar are Professors Alnor Ibrahim and Ian Johnstone, the faculty co-chairs of the Global Diplomacy Institute program. Alnor Ibrahim is the Thomas Smidaini Professor of International Business at the Fletcher School and the Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts University. His research addresses several core dilemmas of social change facing businesses, nonprofit organizations, and public agencies. What strategies should they adopt for delivering and scaling social change? He co-chairs 3 executive programs for business and multilateral organizations. Prior to Fletcher, he taught at Harvard Business School for 10 years. Ian Johnstone is a professor of international law at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. He has been a faculty member since 2000. From 2018 to 2019, he served as interim dean. Prior to that, from 2013 to 2015, he was the academic dean. Before joining Fletcher in 2000, he served in the United Nations Executive Office of the Secretary General. He continues to serve as a regular consultant to the United Nations. With that, I'm honored to welcome Professors Alnor Ibrahim and Ian Johnstone to speak about entrepreneurial diplomacy for the next world order.
Thank you, Ken, and welcome everyone. Wonderful to have so many people join us this morning or this afternoon. I'm going to kick things off talking not about the next world order, but in fact, a few words about the current world order, with a view to sort of setting the stage for a discussion of what kind of diplomacy is necessary to help us get from where we are now to where we may or likely or ought to be or hope to be in the future. So next slide, please. And I'm going to describe 3 features of the current global order, which together make it an unusually destabilizing period. First of all, the unequal distribution of power among state and non-state actors, widespread disregard for international law, including by the great powers, and most importantly, with respect to the fundamental prohibition against the use of force except in certain circumstances. And then third, I'm going to talk about the sort of transactional foreign policy and contrast that with the relational foreign policy and make the case that the first is potentially undermining the second, and that's problematic for global order. Next slide, please. So let me start with the distribution of power. Robert Cohane, Joseph Nye, a couple of American political scientists, international relations scholars, recently wrote an article saying one key attribute of any international order, whatever shape it takes, is there has to be a stable distribution of power. And I think even if you question the more apocalyptic commentary on the end of the global order, I think it's pretty clear that we're living in an unstable moment and the distribution of power is unstable. In fact, it's hard to even understand how power is distributed. And especially if one considers soft power as well as hard power. So, are we in a unipolar moment? No, I don't think so. I think that's pretty clear. Arguably, perhaps the Trump administration is trying to recreate unipolarity, but that doesn't seem to be happening. Bipolarity, obviously, US and China being the two poles, probably not even though it seems at times that they're trying to will such a bipolar order into existence. But given the fact that they have considerably more hard power than other countries around the world, they don't seem to be all that adept at using that hard power, translating that hard power into soft power. And in fact, we're seeing right now that the U.S. administration is squandering the reservoir of soft power that had been accumulated, especially since the end of the Cold War. From China's point of view, I think its attempt to project soft power are largely through its four so-called global initiatives: the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative, and the Global Governance Initiative. And I think while the first has gained some traction, the Global Development Initiative, the other three are still pretty vague and viewed with considerable skepticism by the rest of the world. And the bottom line is we're not seeing other countries lined up neatly on one side or the other. They're perhaps being asked to choose sides, but they're not doing that. And so that leaves us with multipolarity. And I think that probably is the best descriptor of the distribution of power right now. But it's a highly asymmetric kind of multipolarity. So if you look at the two graphs on the right of the screen, clearly the United States and China have considerably more economic power measured in terms of global GDP than any other country. And if you look at military spending, the United States last year was at close to $1 billion. President Trump is talking about increasing that to 1.5 trillion. So considerably more even than China and outpacing the rest of the world. So multipolarity, yes, but an asymmetric kind of multipolarity, and with bits and pieces of the international system, different poles sort of pulling in different directions. And of course, that conception of multipolarity, or the way the term is normally used, misses something else that's really important, which is the power of non-state actors. If you look at the tech company leaders who accompanied Trump to Beijing, it gives you a sense of the power of the private sector. But it's not only the private sector. Philanthropies, the Gates Foundation, for example, is highly influential in the global health business. Large NGOs like Human Rights Watch or Oxfam are influential. So power doesn't reside only among governments and states, it also resides in non-state actors. And as I said, it's really hard to sort of gauge where we are right now. All right, next slide. The second destabilizing feature of the current global order is disregard for international law. And I want to focus on the rules on the use of force, the jus ad bellum and jus in bello, the rules about going to war and the rules about what you can do when you're in a war. And we're seeing those basic rules being violated on a pretty regular basis. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the attacks on Israel by Hamas and Israel's response, the genocidal conflict in Sudan, the attacks on the Venezuelan drug boats, and then the snatching of Maduro, the strikes on Iran, and then Iran's response against Gulf states, all pretty clear violations of international law. And the fact that great powers violate the law is not new. But I think what may be new is we're barely seeing some of these states pay even lip service to international law. They're not even trying to justify what they're doing as a matter of international law. And in fact, President Trump said international law doesn't matter. I don't need international law. And some might be inclined to say, well, good, at least they're being honest. They never really complied with international law, and now they're being honest about what they're doing. And any talk about a rules-based order was always hypocritical. But I would suggest that there's a real risk in that attitude. There's a sort of line of argument that goes back to John Elster, who's a political theorist, but many others have made this argument that hypocrisy itself is not necessarily such a bad thing, and especially if one understands that the choice isn't between hypocrisy and consistent application of the rules. The choice we're looking at now is selective application of the rules or no rules whatsoever. And if that's the choice, I think there's something to be said for hypocrisy, because if states feel compelled somehow to justify what they're doing as a matter of international law, it means that if they fail to live up to their own rhetoric, they pay a reputational price. It creates an opening for other states, smaller states, even domestic public, to bring pressure to bear to try to match deeds with words. If you stop even pretending to care about international law, basically it deprives other states of the opportunity to bring that pressure to bear. Okay, so we're seeing that happen with respect to the rules on the use of force, but we're also seeing it in other areas, in trade law, human rights law, refugee law, law of the sea. And I'm concerned about a withering away of the entire international legal system, which to a certain extent is propped up by a belief in the value of living by these rules. Next slide, please. And then finally, as we all know, US is engaging largely in a transactional kind of foreign policy, and to a certain extent, other countries are following suit. Um, that can be destabilizing. And let me explain how or why by drawing an analogy to transnational versus relational contracts in domestic contract theory. The idea here is that there are some kinds of contracts which are basically a one-off tit for tat exchange. You go and buy a tank of gasoline on the highway, you hand over the money, in exchange, you get a tank of gasoline. That's a transactional contract. Relational contracts are not so much about a one-off exchange, but trying to structure a long-term relationship. And so a collective bargaining agreement between a union and an employer, or a set of employers is an example. And if I can be crass, a marriage is that kind of relational contract. It's not so much about you give me this and I'll give you that, but trying to sort of structure a relationship. And the transactional approach, which obviously is valuable, can work well for some states on some issues. It works well, for example, if you have the economic power to sort of use that to strike good deals for yourself. It works well if you've got something to sell, if you've got oil, or if you've got critical minerals, or if you've got control over the Straits of Hormuz, or if you've got drones that others may want. But it doesn't work for all states. It doesn't work for small states that don't have those sorts of resources and don't really have the bargaining power to effectively operate in a transactional world. And then most importantly, a transactional approach doesn't work for global public policy challenges like climate change or pandemics or the governance of emerging technologies, et cetera. Okay? So what does a relational approach look like? And I think the best way to think about this is think about the constitutive acts of international organizations, which are really just big multilateral treaties. But think about the UN Charter. It's not so much about, I'll give you this and you give me that, but about trying to structure a relationship among every state in the world. And it does that by providing, first of all, a shared normative framework, a frame of reference, a sort of an understanding of the terms of the relationship that everybody in principle adheres to. You may disagree over interpretation or application of the UN Charter, but at least it allows states to speak to rather than past each other. It cultivates a sense of diffuse reciprocity, meaning it's not so much what do I get in a one-off exchange, but what are the broader reciprocal benefits that we all gain from engaging in participating in this relationship, in this institution. And then, somewhat related to that, it cultivates an incentive to have a reputation for playing by the rules, because if you are seen as a scofflaw, breaking the rules whenever convenient, then nobody's going to want to engage in this long-term relationship with you, right? Next slide, please. So let me just conclude briefly with where that leaves us. And let me go back to a speech that I think has received a lot of press, justifiably. Prime Minister Mark Carney at the World Economic Forum delivered a speech in which he said three things. The first two of which have gotten a lot of attention, the third, not so much. Okay? He said, the old order has been ruptured. He said, middle powers need to unite, need to be looking out for themselves, need to be standing up for themselves, and need to unite in doing so. But he also said at the beginning and at the end of the speech, in effect, we need to build back better. Okay? We need to build a more just, a more stable, a more inclusive world order, one that, in his words, includes respect for human rights, sustainable development, sovereignty, territorial integrity. You could have a different list of important values. But the idea there is it's not just about a transactional relationship, but about a longer term structured relationship. Okay. And then the question is, how do we get from here to there? And our answer, at least an answer we'd like to explore with you, is through a new kind of diplomacy that we're calling entrepreneurial diplomacy. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Professor Ibrahim.
Great. Thank you so much, Ian. So I'm Al-Noor Ibrahim, and I want to walk us in the next few minutes into this question of what is entrepreneurial diplomacy, how we define it, and what does it offer in terms of a new way of looking at diplomatic practice, diplomatic mindsets that might help us make sense and navigate this current or emerging world order. And I want to say at the outset that what I'll be presenting briefly is really a series of hypotheses, a series of ideas that we want to propose as a way of thinking about the new work of diplomats. And we look forward to a robust conversation about these in the Q&A period today, but also in the Global Diplomacy Institute itself. So let me start with a definition. And this is a definition that we've created looking at the various definitions of entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship, but also looking at the tasks of diplomats and the conversations that we've had with diplomats, particularly in the first iteration of this program last fall and the focus groups that led up to its creation. So let me read the definition that you see in front of you. Entrepreneurial diplomacy is the process of identifying and seizing opportunities through three different things, right? Through systems intelligence, innovation, and agile action. And I'll walk through each of these three in just a moment, in order to produce novel solutions to complex problems that cross national borders. So there's a lot to unpack here. But the first part, the process of identifying and seizing opportunities. This comes very much from the entrepreneurship literature, which is very much about people rising up to address some sort of a problem or a challenge or a business opportunity without necessarily having the resources to do it, but really sort of identifying an opportunity and finding a way to actually seize it. So that's part of the entrepreneurial mindset. The third part of this, to produce novel solutions to complex problems that cross national boundaries, this is, of course, the work of diplomats, of really looking at these transboundary global or regional problems and trying to find solutions to them. So we've bookended this definition, starting with an entrepreneurial mindset, but really looking to solve the challenges that diplomats tend to work on. And then the middle packaging here is the actual content, which is how, right? And our proposal is that the how relies on systems intelligence, innovation, and agile action. So let me take each of those in turn. So first of all, the complex societal problems. Now, there's many of these. There's three that we actually look at in some detail in the Global Diplomacy Institute, which are all areas in which we have a lot of faculty expertise at Fletcher. And so that's artificial intelligence. We have a joint degree with computer science. We have people working on AI ethics and policy. We bring them into this conversation to help us understand the nature of the transboundary problems here. The second is energy, and of course we see this very much right now with the conflict at the Strait of Hormuz, but more broadly related to climate change, to energy security, to environment. Those are all, of course, transboundary problems that diplomats, through the COP negotiations and others, are constantly working on. And the flows of people across borders, migration being such a major issue, a hot topic that people are even hesitant to use the word migration, but indeed a real challenge for economies, for states. And we're seeing multiple responses to migration. Some are arguing that it's necessary in order to ensure long-term sustained employment and the sustenance of social security. Others are arguing that, particularly in nationalistic terms, that borders need to be closed. So clear an issue that diplomats are struggling with constantly. These are complex societal problems that require long-term thinking. So the three buckets of intervention for entrepreneurial diplomacy, the first of these is systems intelligence, right? There's no way that one can even begin to understand these problems without some pulse, some information, some gathering of constant filtering of data around it. And here, of course, the need for data is cross-sectoral. And so governments alone cannot have enough intelligence to understand what's happening in these arenas. Businesses are a key source of both partnership as well as intelligence. We see this most prominently with artificial intelligence. So most recently with Anthropic holding off the release of its Mythos programming and releasing it only to selected actors, both in government as well as in business, because of the cybersecurity problems and gaps that it has revealed. And so there's much concern about this. And here we see a pointed example of the need for intelligence that draws heavily on business. But arguably also there's a need for partnerships with civil society to understand the effects of some of these challenges on the ground, the effects of energy insecurity, of migration, and civil society organizations become the first line in terms of actually providing intelligence and first response on many of these challenges. And so systems intelligence, diplomats requiring a need to build strong relationships, not only with government, but also with business and civil society. And we do that systematically through this program. Last year, we had a visit to Oxfam's headquarters here in Boston, where we also brought in other civil society leaders to talk about efforts that they'd made to work with diplomats and what was successful and what was not. And we had a similar event with a technology startup incubator locally located here, where we also brought in some of the big tech firms. Here, too, to echo Ian's previous comment about the transactional versus relational types of relationships and contracting, we know that to gather this kind of intelligence, to be able to share it, it requires building relationships of trust. And so trust becomes part of the critical currency for this to occur, which requires long-term relationship building. And as a result, the identification of opportunities through that systems intelligence that diplomats might be able to seize to make traction on some of these challenges. So that's the first bucket, right? What would systems intelligence building look like? What's already in place? And what might new partnerships with business and civil society further enable? The second, drawing from the entrepreneurship literature, is this widely and sometimes loosely used term innovation. We're using it here specifically to look at how can one build up a culture of innovation within diplomatic organizations. So ministries of foreign affairs, foreign service organizations, and their partners. So if we look internally at the organizations, what we're hearing from the diplomats that we work with is that, first of all, there's a recruitment challenge. Who are the people inside the organization? Some are having trouble recruiting talent into their organizations, either because the budgets have been cut or because new talent is not seeing um, uh, ministries of foreign affairs as career opportunities for them. So there's a recruitment challenge and a need to identify people and recruit them who are see their work as being about problem solving and being able to think in systemic terms, who actually have the DNA around systems intelligence. So recruitment is the first innovation challenge inside ministries, consulates, and others. The second is the design of teams internally. And so rather than highly siloed work, different departments, different units, we know that the challenges of innovation require teams that are work across functions and across silos. And so how can one actually build these cross-silo and cross-functional teams becomes a real challenge within the organizations. And then, of course, the bigger picture here is how do you create a culture within your organization that incentivizes creativity and experimentation, which runs up against sort of the much needed sort of protocols that are highly structured for good reason, in fact. And so there's a tension here between creating highly creative experimental cultures and ones that actually follow protocols that have some predictability in them. We need to figure out a way of actually merging both. So innovation, as we argue here, is not just sort of in a product or a service of businesses, but actually within diplomatic organizations, ministries of foreign affairs, in terms of how we recruit people, design teams, and then create a culture of incentives within them. The third bucket that these two elements, the systems intelligence and the innovation, arguably can enable is much more agile action, rapid, adaptable action in order to adjust to this rapidly changing world order. And so the key here is to be able to identify and seize opportunities as they arise, because the timeframes of long-term negotiations may not be able to keep pace with the rapidly changing nature of the challenges that we face, such as in artificial intelligence, energy security, and migration. And this requires an ability to mobilize relationships. So if the relationships have been built over time and are strong, one might be able to mobilize them more quickly. It requires an ability to share expertise and resources across partners, and then to create new forms of governance and executing on addressing these challenges. So let me give just two very brief examples of where we think some of these three elements are actually in practice. The first is Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, which initially rose to prominence around AIDS vaccines, but then certainly in COVID and the launch of COVAX attracted a lot of attention in terms of not only enabling innovation around vaccine development, but also innovation around the financing of vaccine development and distribution in the global south. And so really working with partners, vaccine developers, working across sectors with multiple governments, multiple vaccine developers, so businesses, and civil society organizations in order to get vaccines on the ground. There have been multiple critiques of Gavi, but we think where the innovation has been is very much in the organizational design and structure of it. It's truly multi-sectoral, and so it has diplomatic agencies, governmental agencies involved, but very much in partnership with business, philanthropy, and civil society. The other, which has been much more sort of along the lines of traditional diplomacy, but innovating within those boundaries, has been the Alliance of Small Island States, right? So roughly 39 countries, all at high risk of effects related to climate change, inundation, possibly extinction, that have mobilized very effectively in order to get their agendas on the map in the climate change negotiations, getting the 1.5 degrees Celsius target in the Paris Agreement, and so on. And so what we would normally think of as a set of states that are very under-resourced, very small, not having a lot of leverage, have punched well above their weight as a result of developing systems intelligence, innovating in the way that they actually do their diplomacy and engage with their partners and other governments, and then actually moving quickly in order to engage in action. So two very different examples where we see entrepreneurial diplomacy actually taking root. The last slide that I want to share with you is a way of thinking about the role of leadership to support entrepreneurial diplomacy. And here I draw on the work of Ronald Heifetz and Donald Laurie, an essay that they wrote on the work of leadership almost 2 decades ago that remains highly relevant. And they distinguish between the work of leaders that's technical and adaptive. And what you see right now is the technical work of leaders. And here, the role of leadership is to set direction, in which case you define the problems as well as provide solutions. This works for highly technocratic problems that typically are under the control of a single organization or ministry. It doesn't work as well for transboundary complex problems. But traditionally, we tend to think of the work of leadership in this way. We expect guidance and we expect solutions from leaders. We also expect leaders to provide protection, which is to shield the organization from external threats, to say, here's going to be the work of the organization, and we will enable you to actually do it. The orientation of this work is to give people very specific roles and responsibilities. We see this in job descriptions all the time, and you stay within that silo, within that swimming lane. And they manage conflict by trying to insulate the organization from it and having particular norms or protocols of ways of doing things that get codified over time. This works in highly structured, well-contained organizational contexts. It does not work for highly complex problems that require constant adaptation. So what Heifetz and Laurie suggest here is that the work of leadership actually changes. So on the first, in terms of setting direction, the task of the leaders is to identify the adaptive challenges, to say, we need to be working towards addressing these problems, whether they have to do with energy or migration or artificial intelligence, and framing the questions, but not offering solutions, because the solutions must be collectively developed. This is hard for leaders to say, I don't actually have the answers, but here's a framing of how we might collectively approach the solutions to those. It also means letting one's organizations feel external pressure. So the pressure can actually be productive if it galvanizes new ways of behaving and thinking, changing mindsets and changing actions. It requires us to then change the current roles within our organizations. So does the current hierarchy still work? Maybe it needs to be broken apart in different ways in order to enable much more creative thinking and problem solving. And here, conflict might actually be a productive thing within an organization in order to then challenge unproductive norms and develop new ways of thinking about things. So I've given you a definition of entrepreneurial diplomacy, 3 buckets around it, and as a result, a new way of thinking about the work of leadership in order to actually address it. I want to hand off at this moment briefly back to Ken to give you a brief overview of the Global Diplomacy Institute, and then we'll open it up for questions. Ken.
Thank you so much, Alnor, and thank you, Ian. Now, this is just one small thing about the Global Diplomacy Institute. On the left side of your screen, you'll see an action-packed week, Monday through Thursday, or Monday through Friday, even Sunday with arrivals. But a quick overview of what you can expect as a participant in our upcoming Global Diplomacy Institute. You'll see core sessions, you'll see teamwork sessions, of course, site visits and keynotes, and time for social events as you spend time here in Medford and in Greater Boston. Focus areas of the program include geopolitical trends and strategic forecasting, AI, cyber risk and emerging technologies, public-private collaboration in statecraft, climate and energy strategy, humanitarian affairs, migration, and even more that isn't listed here, but we just wanted to share a brief overview and a glimpse of what you can expect during your week here at the Fletcher School. Now, for those interested, please use the Q&A tab in your Zoom screen and window or the chat function to submit your questions. We have some that have been already submitted ahead of time that we will get into in the next minute. And if you are interested in applying to the program, I'm just going to paste the link here in the chat for the Global Diplomacy Institute. And now we are going to begin our Q&A section. Thank you, everyone. Okay, here is a question that was submitted ahead of today's webinar. Paste it here in the chat for everyone to see. For Ian and for Alnor, what would be the best strategies for small states diplomacy and attaining sustainable development?
Elnur, should I kick that
Sure.
one off? Sure. Yeah. Yeah, a few thoughts on that. And a good question because it's one thing for a powerful state to exercise its diplomatic muscle. It's a slightly different challenge for smaller states. But I would start by um, advising small states to act early, to take the initiative. Don't sit back and wait and assume somebody else is going to take the lead. I think in this complex, multipolar, multi-aligned environment, there's plenty of opportunities to take initiatives. If you're a small state, build coalitions, find partners, make sure that you engage not only with other national level governments, but sub-state actors, maybe even non-state actors, draw on the expertise that may be there. And then finally, don't give up on the multilateral institutions. It's one thing to build a sort of small coalition of willing, but if you're a small state, you're going to need somewhere to exercise the sort of collective power that that coalition can build. And it's not so easy to do that outside of a multilateral framework. The multilateral institutions provide some processes and some structure in order to enable smaller states to have their voices heard that may not exist in a sort of purely minimalist, minilateral approach to diplomacy.
Yes, and to echo that, I would add that, the example I gave of the Alliance of Small Island States is working through multilateral diplomatic channels. And it's done exactly what Ian has said in terms of building coalitions, focusing on a core issue that everybody agrees with, that then galvanizes action. And we may see the emergence of something like this also around artificial intelligence. So one of our colleagues, Bhaskar Chakravorty, who's our Dean of Global Business, we actually have a whole built out business curriculum at Fletcher. Dean Chakravorty has been doing a lot of work looking at, which are the states that are leading on technology and artificial intelligence, not necessarily in terms of building the pioneering frontier models, but in terms of actually getting the technology into the hands of citizens in an equitable way that helps advance society. And one of the leaders in this is a small state, it's Estonia.
Mhm.
And so there's lots of examples of small states that have taken on leadership roles where the possibility for building coalitions, partnering with businesses and with civil society on a particular issue that nobody else is really taking the lead on, I think becomes an opportunity. And that's where the entrepreneurial mindset is, I think, very helpful. Rather than waiting, seizing that opportunity and saying, here's an issue that is really critical, our state can actually take the lead on it and identifying coalition partners around it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Elnor. Here's another question, pasting here in the chat. What skills will be most critical for future entrepreneurial diplomats? Negotiation, innovation, policy understanding, digital influence, or something else?
Hmm.
So maybe I'll start with
Sure.
that one. Well, first of all, all of those skills that were just listed are obviously important. Um, some of them are the traditional skills of diplomats, negotiation, policy understanding. Two that I thought were kind of new were innovation and digital influence. And the innovation piece, I realized that this is a tough one because most diplomatic units, whether they're embassies or consulates or ministries or foreign service offices, are not set up to experiment, to try something new, to innovate. And because of sort of protocols. And But I think there's an opportunity, especially as young people come into the diplomatic corps, to say, well, what can we actually innovate on? Could we experiment with something? This requires a little bit of breaking down of formal structures of hierarchy, enabling much more creation of fluid teams, cross-functional, cross-silo teams. So that I think is probably a maybe not an entirely new, but a set of skills that requires considerable development. It also requires senior leaders within diplomatic organizations to learn to let go a little bit and allow younger talent to experiment and to provide the forums for doing this. And we learned actually from three participants we had last year from Poland that they were actually doing some of this around artificial intelligence, that they would design forums that would bring together people from all levels of the ministry. And hierarchies actually were kind of checked at the door in those conversations. It, it was harder to make it happen in other issue areas, but because of the challenges of AI, it created an opportunity for people to actually come together and think much more innovatively across hierarchies on these issues. So that's just one example of that.
Yeah, let me just add one quick thought, which is that sort of tying into what Professor Ibrahim said about senior leadership empowering diplomats and those that are sort of closer to the ground. I think that's important and challenging, but necessary because, the pace at which public policy issues move sort of it's too fast for traditional diplomatic approaches. And, think even about social media, understanding not necessarily how to use social media, but how social media is being used by others is critically important. And, sometimes what is happening one day can change overnight as a result of some information or misinformation that's flown around the world. And I think diplomats need to be agile enough to respond to that. And I think it probably means that they need to be empowered to respond on their own initiative more so than in the past, as opposed to waiting for instructions from capitals.
Fantastic. Thank you, Elnor and Ian. We have another submitted question here. In the context of diplomacy, how can hierarchical institutional structures be reconciled with the need for agility and rapid response to multidimensional policy challenges?
That is the trillion-dollar question, isn't it? I can't say that we have any silver bullets on this. I do think it requires a conversation led by leadership within those hierarchical institutions to say, are we fit for purpose? And if not, what can we do differently? And to actually lead that conversation. And notice this is an adaptive leadership challenge, right? So that last slide that I showed between the technical work and the adaptive work, this requires leadership to say, we don't actually have the answers to this. It's what Heifetz calls giving the work back to the people. And so to frame the challenge and say, there's issues that we don't understand, perhaps, or there's issues around which we don't know how to build coalitions, or we don't know how to build partnerships with business or civil society. Can we frame the issues and then develop working groups within the ministry to actually figure out how to do this, and then to propose creative solutions that we can work through together? And so it requires a very different approach that is collective problem solving oriented. And it connects to another question that I saw, which was, what are the differences between introducing and fostering a culture of entrepreneurship in a traditional corporate business environment versus a diplomatic one? So in a corporate environment, you're typically trying to promote or develop a product or a service. And you put a lot of innovation around that, the creation of it and the marketing of it, which is a very different and arguably much easier challenge than the one facing diplomats, where it's not a particular product or a service you're trying to sell. It's national interests that you're trying to advocate for, and possibly also wearing a global hat and advocating for some global interests. And so it's a much longer term, much more complex transboundary sets of challenges. So we don't want to suggest that sort of the business thinking here applies across the board. No. But where I think there is a crucial difference, where there is a crucial similarity, is trying to build a culture that enables creative thinking, experimentation, and recognizing that sometimes it's not going to work. But by iterating on it, you'll be able to figure it out. I think that's really key.
Yeah, and one sort of further thought, and we picked this up clearly last year during the Global Diplomacy Institute program, which is it's not realistic to expect mid-level diplomats to sort of break down the hierarchy, and it's not wise to try to break down the hierarchy. These hierarchical structures are there for a reason. You can't have every diplomat making decisions on behalf of the country on their own impulse or initiative. And so I think the idea here is to work within the hierarchical structures that exist, but allow some more creativity and flexibility within those structures. And so the trick is to find the right balance. And that's not going to be the same for every country. There are some countries where it's going to work better than other countries to sort of empower the diplomats at the ground level. And there are other countries that maybe need to have that slightly more rigid approach and be careful to report back to headquarters often.
Thank you, Ian and Eleanor. I'm going to combine two questions here. Uh, I want to be cognizant of time and thank you everyone for staying on. If it's okay with you and Ian, we have several more to go through. So I want to pair these two together. In your view, which countries tend to have more entrepreneurial diplomats than others? What are the background factors that foster their entrepreneurship? Can you kindly give one or two specific examples of entrepreneurial diplomacy? Seems a bit of an oxymoron, and a skill not mentioned could be called internal bureaucracy efficiency skill.
I'll give one example. Liechtenstein. I spent some years at the United Nations, and so I'm kind of familiar with the way things work there. And it can be a difficult place to get things done. But Liechtenstein has been surprisingly influential on a range of initiatives, including the creation of the International Criminal Court, but also more recently on something called the Veto Initiative, which basically is a decision taken in the UN General Assembly that in effect requires the 5 permanent members who use the veto, who exercise their veto power in the Security Council, to go to the General Assembly and justify why they use their veto. And this initiative was pushed by Liechtenstein. The ambassador of Liechtenstein has been in New York for many years, so having the institutional memory was important there, had developed a relationship and a kind of trust among the other diplomats. Saw an opportunity, saw a moment, seized a moment after Russia's invasion of Ukraine when there seemed to be real consternation about the use of the veto, and sort of took that moment to build the coalition, to get things started in the General Assembly, producing this resolution, which at the end of the day was adopted by consensus, meaning the 5 permanent members themselves agreed to this. Okay? So that's an example of entrepreneurial diplomacy by a very small state that was initiated by an ambassador who had been at it for a long time and was able to sort of pull upon the web of relationships that he'd already built, and seeing the moment was right, sort of seized that moment and jumped.
And let me give one more example from a completely different angle. So I mentioned earlier Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, Vaccine Initiative. So this was an initiative that's on one side outside of diplomacy. It's not a Ministry of Foreign Affairs initiative. It's an independent nonprofit organization. But if you look at their board, it has at a minimum 5 governments on it that are implementing countries. So from the global south, 5 from the global north that are donor countries, plus the World Bank, UNICEF, World Health Organization, vaccine industry, so businesses, both in the developing countries as well as in industrial countries, and then civil society organizations, plus a series of independent individuals. And so if you think about some of the implementing countries, governments that are represented on there, Ethiopia, Ghana, Indonesia, Bhutan, Somalia, Pakistan, to name a few. And so these are primarily small states, that have really sort of taken the initiative to be active on vaccines and are sending people from their own governments to be a part of it. And so it's the creation and participation in a structure that sits outside of diplomatic circles, but heavily engages uh, governments, business, and civil society on it. That's seizing an opportunity. That's it's entrepreneurial in that sense, but it's also diplomatic in another sense. And so, but it's outside of the formal structures, enabling the creation of a very different structure that plays an important global role.
Ken, before we get another question, I want us 15 more seconds on another small state that's been entrepreneurial and influential. It's Costa Rica. And last year, at our institute, we had the former president of Costa Rica, Carlos Alvarado, speak to the group. And he described the many different ways on environment and even in the UN protection of civilians issues in which Costa Rica has been influential. So he had, I think, a 45-minute sort of talk on the sorts of things that he was able to do as president and that he was able to stimulate among his diplomats.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Alnor. We have time for a couple more questions, if that's okay with you. I want to share this one that came in. How do you link new initiatives, like small state initiatives, to the larger multilateral processes? For example, voluntary climate pacts and actions.
Uh, Great question. Um, I, again, I'm a strong believer in trying to preserve and use what's valuable about the larger multilateral structures. And therefore, coalitions can be built, but at a certain point, these coalitions do have to move into the multilateral fora on things like climate change or pandemics or governance of artificial intelligence or even migration for that matter, because they are global challenges. And so again, I think that the trick here is to sort of build the coalition, work within these institutions. And then the question, of course, is always, from a legal point of view, do you want to turn a voluntary pact into a legally binding pact? And that's a different set of questions. And again, this is where diplomacy becomes so important because it's not always the right move to say, okay, we now have to move from voluntariness to binding obligations because that can sometimes backfire. You know, if you start sort of pushing in the direction of binding obligations, you might generate resistance that isn't going to be there with respect to voluntary pacts. So I think, you know, working within the multilateral institutions and then deciding the extent to which you want to try to institutionalize, codify whatever it is that you've agreed to as a policy matter.
Fantastic. We have one time for one more question here, and I'll paste this in the chat. In your introduction, you highlighted the importance of non-state actors and specifically the private sector. As we witness and experience immense power accrue to a handful of companies infringing on state power and sovereignty, how do you see this dynamic evolving?
Yeah, I think, one of the key questions of our time, particularly with artificial intelligence, and where we see the power of firms, right, of businesses, really overtaking the power of the state on these issues. If you think back to the various summits on AI, initially the Bletchley Park Summit in the UK, and then the most recent one in India, the talk of regulation has declined with each successive summit. There's a little bit more attention to it now after Anthropic's, release of Mythos or partial release of Mythos, where governments are a little bit more fearful, and so now beginning to look at regulation a bit more. But um, there's no substitute for global diplomacy on artificial intelligence. There's just no alternative, and so we have to find a way to make it happen. But I think what this does illustrate is the need to actually work very closely with business, but also with civil society, some of the watchdogs, some of the people that are raising the concerns about society, and equity and distribution of the benefits of artificial intelligence, but also the harms of it. And so the only players that can actually do this are governments at a multilateral level. And so, but we do need governments to learn how to work much more closely and proactively with business as well as civil society. This has to be a trilateral conversation.
Yeah, and one of the private sector and especially the tech companies are powerful for a couple of reasons. One is because they've got money and resources, but also because they've got expertise. And I think that the challenge here is to make sure that expertise and reliance on expertise is balanced against the importance of inclusive politics. So in other words, don't sort of hand over the reins to those who have the expertise, assuming that they're going to come up with the best public policy outcomes. Make sure that that's situated in a more inclusive kind of diplomatic process if we're talking about moving beyond national borders. And that, of course, involves governments and it involves, as Eleanor said, civil society.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much, Eleanor. Thank you, Ian. And thank you, everyone, for submitting your questions. I know we couldn't get to every single one today, but thank you for your continued engagement and your continued support of Fletcher programming. That concludes today's webinar on entrepreneurial diplomacy for the next world order. Stay tuned for our next upcoming webinar. You'll receive an email and, of course, the recording to today's episode shortly. Thank you all for attendance, and we'll see you very soon in the near future.